Imagine spending your entire life piecing together this massive, highly controversial puzzle about the ancient origins of human society.
Yeah, you're literally down in the dirt reading the earth.
Right. You are carefully brushing away millennia of soil, and you synthesize thousands of artifacts, you cross-reference them with ancient folklore, and finally, you present this cohesive, beautifully radical picture to the world.
And the response from your peers is just, well, it's brutal.
It is. The academic establishment completely dismisses you. I mean, they laugh you right out of the room.
It goes way beyond just mere dismissal, too. They
Yeah.
actively dismantle your reputation.
Yeah.
They frame your life's work as little more than a fairy tale. Like it's a symptom of an overactive imagination rather than, rigorous science.
Which has to be devastating. But then, and this is the crazy part, fast forward a few decades,
Right.
you are no longer around to defend yourself. The textbooks have all been written without you. But suddenly, a revolutionary new scientific technology emerges from the laboratories of the 21st century.
And it changes everything.
It really does, because
yeah.
this technology looks at the exact same history, the exact same dirt, and it proves that you were right all along.
Down to the microscopic genetic detail. It's wild.
It is the ultimate scientific redemption story, a complete paradigm shift that forced an entire academic discipline to issue a massive, very public apology.
I love this story.
Me too. And that is the journey we are taking you on today. We are taking a deep dive into the life, the groundbreaking theories, and the ultimate scientific vindication of Marija Gimbutas.
She was a pioneering Lithuanian-American archaeologist who fundamentally changed how we understand our ancient past.
Absolutely. And rather than just, listing off our sources today, we are going to weave them directly into the story.
Because we are pulling from a literal mountain of evidence for this deep dive.
We really are. We've got the physical archival boxes of her life's work cataloged in the Opus archives.
Which is staggering in its scale.
Oh, yeah. We also have a booky summary of her seminal text, The Language of the Goddess, which decodes all these ancient symbols.
And then, crucially, we're using a fascinating academic review by researcher Anne van der Meer, which details the modern DNA bombshells.
So our mission today is to explore how Gimbutas mapped out a peaceful, female-centered world she called Old Europe.
Right, and we will examine how she theorized its violent, sudden end at the hands of steppe nomads.
And critically, how modern archaeogenetics forced the scientific community to basically eat their words. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Before we can even begin to understand the wild clash of these ancient civilizations, we first need to understand the unique mind of the woman who uncovered them.
Because Marija Gimbutas was definitely not your standard mid-century Western archaeologist.
Not at all. Her background is the entire key to why she saw things that everyone else in her field was completely blind to.
Her origin story is entirely foundational to her methodology. I mean, she was born in Lithuania in 1921.
Just consider the timing and the geography of that for a second.
Right. She is growing up in Eastern Europe between the two world wars.
And she is surrounded by a culture that, unlike the heavily industrialized West, still held very deep living ties to its agrarian roots.
Yeah, to its ancient myths and its folklore.
And she wasn't just, passively observing this environment either. She was studying it with intense academic rigor from a very young age.
Even before she received her PhD at Tübingen University in Germany in 1946.
Where she focused specifically on prehistoric burial rites, right?
Exactly. Even before that, she was immersing herself in linguistics, ethnology, folklore, and literature at the University of Vilnius.
She was constantly marrying the physical evidence of the earth with the intangible evidence of human storytelling.
Which is such a unique skill set.
It really is. So she moves to the United States in 1949, and she begins working at Harvard's Peabody Museum.
And because of her incredible linguistic skills, she is translating Eastern European archaeological reports that Western scholars simply couldn't read.
They were completely locked out of that data without her.
Right. And eventually she becomes a professor emeritus at UCLA, teaching and researching there from 1963 to 1989.
And we really need to pause here to truly conceptualize the physical volume of the work she produced during those decades.
It's hard to even wrap your head around.
It is. The Opus Archives Finding Aid gives us the literal measurements of her legacy. Her collection holds 164 linear feet of material.
Let's translate that for the listener, because linear feet sounds a bit abstract.
Good idea. A standard banker's box, the kind you pack your office up in when you switch jobs.
Yeah.
That holds about 1 linear foot of files.
Okay.
So I want you to picture almost 164 of those boxes stacked to the ceiling.
Wow.
We are talking about nearly 300 archival boxes packed with dense academic research, meticulous field notes, and translations of obscure folklore.
That collection also includes over 12,000 individual slides.
Just imagine the sheer time it takes to catalog, annotate, and analyze 12,000 visual data points before computers, too.
Exactly. And it holds countless maps, massive blueprints from her direct excavations at sites like Achillean in Greece.
And a personal research library of over 1,500 volumes.
She was definitely not an armchair theorist. She was synthesizing a Himalayan mountain of physical, geographical, and historical data.
And this massive synthesis leads to her revolutionary methodology. She actually coined a new term for it, right?
Yeah, she called it archaeomythology.
Archaeomythology. It was a completely interdisciplinary approach.
She decided to blend archaeology, the hard science of digging up artifacts and carbon dating them,
with linguistics, ethnography, folklore, and mythology.
What's fascinating here is how her specific Eastern European background allowed her to synthesize these fields to see the unseen.
Because at the time, Western archaeology was totally dominated by a movement known as processual archaeology.
Right, and processualism was highly, highly rigid.
Very rigid. It focused entirely on environmental adaptation, economics, and hard measurable data.
I want to use an analogy here to make sure I understand this, because it sounds remarkably similar to what was happening in psychology around the exact same time.
Oh, with behaviorism.
Yes. In psychology, behaviorists argued that you can't study the mind or thoughts because they are invisible. Right.
You can only study observable actions.
Exactly. It sounds like professional archaeology was doing the exact same thing to history.
That is an incredibly precise parallel.
They were saying, we can't study ancient beliefs or myths because we can't put them on a scale.
Yeah. We can only study how they adapted to their environment or, like, what they ate.
The processualists looked at a piece of Neolithic pottery and basically asked, what is the volume of grain this can hold?
What temperature was the kiln fired at to create this? They viewed artifacts strictly as functional tools for survival.
But Gimbutas comes along and says, wait a minute, human beings don't just leave behind bones and grain silos.
They leave behind belief systems.
Right. And because she intimately understood the rich, enduring folklore of Eastern Europe, she looked at that exact same piece of pottery and saw a canvas for a story.
She was looking at the symbols etched into the clay.
She realized that to understand these ancient people, you couldn't just measure their tools. You had to decode their art.
I have to stop you there, though.
Okay.
Because I can already hear the critics screaming, and honestly, I share a bit of their skepticism here.
That's fair.
If I look at a pot with some squiggly lines on it, and I decide it means Mother Goddess,
Yeah.
and you look at the exact same pot and decide it means a good river for fishing, who is right?
Right, that's the problem.
Doesn't blending mythology with hard dirt run the risk of immense confirmation bias? Like, how does she avoid just writing historical fan fiction?
That is the exact critique leveled at her by the establishment, and it's a totally valid scientific concern.
Yeah.
However, Gimbutas wasn't just guessing based on a single pot. She was looking at patterns across tens of thousands of artifacts spanning thousands of miles and thousands of years.
That changes things.
Right. When you see the exact same intricate spiral pattern on a piece of pottery in the Balkans, carved into a megalith in Western Europe, and then echoed in the foundational linguistic roots of the region's oldest folklore.
That ceases to be a random squiggle.
Exactly. That is a deliberate, codified language.
So it's less like guessing what a cloud looks like and more like cracking a cipher?
Yes.
It brings to mind modern forensics, actually.
How so?
Well, if you are a detective trying to solve a complex corporate crime and you only use traditional fingerprinting...
You might find out who physically touched a glass in the boardroom.
Right. But if you completely ignore the suspects' digital footprints, their offshore financial records, their encrypted text messages...
Which in this case represents the folklore, the linguistics, the mythology.
Exactly. If you ignore all that, you are never going to understand the motive. You'll never get the full picture of the crime.
She was looking for the motive. She was trying to reconstruct the underlying cultural operating system of these ancient peoples.
So, applying this interdisciplinary archaeomythology to the artifacts of the Neolithic era, what exactly did she uncover?
Well, wait.
Let me set this up for the listener first.
Oh, sure.
I want you, the listener, to try and imagine understanding our modern 21st century culture by only looking at our garbage dumps.
That's a great thought experiment.
Right. Imagine trying to understand us without knowing a single thing about our religions, our movies, our political debates, or our languages.
You would probably assume we worship plastic bottles and internal combustion engines.
Exactly. That is the massive blind spot Gimbutas was trying to illuminate.
And when she applied this lens to Neolithic Europe, and we are talking about the period roughly between 7,000 and 3,500 BC,
So long before the Roman Empire.
long before written history entirely, she deciphered what she called a forgotten language.
It wasn't a language of syntax and grammar.
No, this is a robust language of symbols.
Which gives us the title of her famous book, The Language of the Goddess.
Armed with her methodology, Gimbutas proposed a thesis that sent absolute shockwaves through the academic world.
She theorized that before the violent influence of Indo-European cultures, Old Europe was metrifocal, it was egalitarian, and it was deeply reverent of a mother goddess.
And just to be entirely clear for you listening, because our source material emphasizes this very deeply.
Yes, this is an important disclaimer.
We are exploring Gimbutas' thesis purely through her archaeological lens. We are impartially reporting on her findings.
We aren't projecting modern 21st century gender politics onto the past. We are simply looking at the physical evidence she synthesized.
Right. Evidence describing a society that was fundamentally different from the one we inhabit today.
It was a society where the divine was perceived as female, but not in the way we typically conceptualize deities today, right?
No, not at all. The goddess wasn't a ruler sitting on a celestial throne somewhere in the sky, dictating laws and handing down punishments.
The goddess was nature itself.
She was the earth, the giver of all life, the sustainer of the seasons, and the eventual welcoming receiver of life at death.
And the symbols that left behind, the language she spent decades decoding, paint an incredibly vivid picture of this mindset.
Let's look at the specific imagery mentioned in the booky summary of her text.
Yeah, let's start with the spirals.
You find spirals absolutely everywhere in old European art. They're painted onto pottery, carved deep into stone monuments, etched into bone tools.
And to a processual archaeologist, that might just be a decorative flourish, just someone making it look pretty.
But Gimbutas interpreted the spiral as the ultimate representation of the life cycle: birth, growth, death, and rebirth.
It mirrors the natural sequences found in the environment, doesn't it?
Exactly. Think of the coil of a fern frond unfurling in the spring.
Or the shape of a weather system, or the vortex of a whirlpool.
It symbolizes continuity and the eternal return. The idea that energy never dies. It just changes form.
Then you have circles.
Yes. Think about the geometry of a circle for a moment.
Yeah. There is no top, there is no bottom, there is no corner to get trapped in.
It inherently lacks hierarchy. It embodies unity and wholesomeness.
In the context of the goddess, Gimbutas noted that the circle heavily represents the womb, right?
Yes, the ultimate creatress and incubator of life.
And then we encounter perhaps the most misunderstood symbol by modern standards, the snake.
Oh, this is a big one. In our current cultural context, which has been heavily influenced by later Judeo-Christian traditions, the snake is almost universally a symbol of deceit, temptation, or evil.
Right. But in Old Europe, Gimbutas found that the snake was deeply revered.
It was a sacred symbol.
Why? I mean, what is it about a snake that says divine to an ancient farmer?
Because it sheds its skin. To an ancient person observing nature closely, a snake appears to possess the secret of immortality.
Because it grows old, its skin dulls, and then it sloughs off that old form to emerge shiny, renewed, and reborn.
It was the perfect living metaphor for regeneration.
That makes so much sense.
Furthermore, snakes live close to the earth, often disappearing into holes in the ground.
Making them creatures intimately connected to the underworld.
Exactly, connecting to the hidden, transformative, subterranean powers of nature.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think about how symbols dictate a society's psychology.
Okay.
If your primary cultural symbols are pyramids, or ladders, or swords.
You are constantly training your brain to think in terms of hierarchy.
Right. You think about climbing to the top, about dominance, about conquest. In that system, there is always a winner and a loser.
A vertical operating system.
Exactly, a vertical operating system. But if your primary symbols are the circle and the spiral,
your entire worldview shifts laterally.
You don't think about climbing to the top. You think about participating in an ongoing cycle.
You think about ecology, the turning of the seasons, and returning to where you started.
It's a completely different mental framework.
And this framework extended to their physical representations of the divine as well. Let's look at the famous Venus figurines.
I've seen pictures of these.
They are these small statues, often carved from stone or molded from clay, featuring enlarged breasts, abdomens, and hips. They are found all over prehistoric sites.
And for decades earlier, male-dominated interpretations of archaeology routinely dismissed these merely as primitive fertility fetishes.
Or even prehistoric pornography.
Just dismissing them as an ancient, unevolved obsession with sex and reproduction.
But Gimbutas, using her interdisciplinary approach, viewed them as powerful, sacred icons of the goddess's nurturing, life-giving attributes.
They were meant to be titillating.
Not at all. They were revered representations of the Earth's abundance.
She also identified bird goddesses, didn't she?
Yes. Figurines combining human female forms with avian features like beaks or wings.
And what did those represent?
They represented the sky, the celestial realm, and the soul's journey after death. The divine feminine covered the entire spectrum of existence, from the deep soil to the open sky.
And what I find so compelling about the source material is that this wasn't a Sunday-only religion.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we aren't talking about a society that built massive, distant temples where only an elite priesthood could commune with the divine while the peasants toiled in the mud.
Right.
The sacred was woven into the mundane.
The divine was democratic. These sacred symbols are absolutely everywhere.
They were painted on the clay ovens where families baked their daily bread.
They were carved into the spindle whorls used to weave clothing.
So when you baked bread, you weren't just making dinner. You were participating in the goddess's cycle of transformation.
Turning raw grain into sustaining life.
When you planted a seed, you were interacting directly with her womb. It was a deeply integrated, peaceful existence, heavily focused on agriculture, art, and the predictable cycles of the seasons.
I want you to pause and really think about that for a second. Think about the imagery you surround yourself with daily.
Oh, like the corporate logos on your phone.
The towering phallic architecture of your city's financial district.
The aggressive, fast-paced media you consume.
How do those visual cues shape your personal values, your concept of success, or your baseline anxiety without you even realizing it?
For old Europe, their visual cues constantly reinforced a subconscious message of natural balance, communal participation, and cyclical renewal.
It paints a beautiful picture of a stable, egalitarian society.
But as we all know, looking at the news today, that is absolutely not the dominant cultural operating system of modern human history.
Which brings us to a massive historical pivot point.
If old Europe was this stable, cyclical, goddess-worshipping, peaceful society,
what happened? Why don't we live in that world today?
that brings us to the most dramatic and, for a very long time, the most hotly debated aspect of Marija Gimbutas' entire body of work.
The Kurgan theory.
The Kurgan theory. This is where the story shifts abruptly from a peaceful agricultural cycle to a violently abrupt collision of worlds.
Gimbutas proposed that starting around 4300 BC, this stable old European world was completely shattered by 4 distinct waves of violent invasions.
And these invaders didn't come from neighboring farms.
No, they came from the Pontic-Caspian steppes.
Paint a picture of that geography for us. What is the steppe like?
The Pontic-Caspian steppe is a massive, unforgiving stretch of grassy plains. It extends from the northern shores of the Black Sea as far east as the Caspian Sea.
So covering parts of modern-day Ukraine and Russia.
Exactly. It is a harsh, open environment.
Gimbutas called these people the Kurgan culture, named after the Russian word for the distinct burial mounds they left behind.
Today, in modern archaeology, they are often referred to as the Yamnaya culture.
And the catalyst for this massive movement of people wasn't necessarily inherent evil or pure bloodlust, was it?
No, it was ecology. The sources point heavily to climate change.
Natural disasters and a deteriorating, rapidly cooling climate pushed these steppe tribes to the absolute brink.
They lived in an environment where survival demanded extreme adaptability.
Because when the climate turns cold and dry, the grass dies.
And when the grass dies, your herds die. Their survival suddenly depended entirely on aggressive mobility.
And the culture that developed on these harsh steppes in a response to that environment was the absolute antithesis of old Europe.
Let's do a side-by-side comparison because it's jarring.
Okay, we just established old Europe as agricultural, settled, peaceful, matrifocal, and worshiping the earth.
The Kurgan or Yamnaya people had a completely different toolkit for survival. Let's start with their diet and economy.
They had a pastoral economy based heavily on meat, dairy products, and fish.
There is little to no evidence of sustained agriculture. They didn't grow crops, they herded animals,
They were highly mobile, essentially living in wagons.
which were basically the prehistoric equivalent of mobile homes.
They were moving their herds constantly between summer and winter pastures to avoid starvation.
And this mobility was supercharged by one of the most consequential technological innovations in human history.
The domestication of the horse.
Yes. The horse and the wagon gave them unprecedented range, speed, and logistical superiority over settled farmers.
And naturally, their spiritual life reflected their harsh environment.
They didn't worship a nurturing subterranean earth goddess.
They worshipped masculine sky gods, gods of thunder, lightning, and the vast open canopy of the steppe.
Because the sky dictates the weather, and on the steppe, the weather dictates if you live or die.
They also possessed advanced metallurgy, specifically the ability to forge metal weapons.
So you have a highly mobile, meat-eating, weapon-wielding, horse-riding society driven to desperation by climate pressure.
Rolling right into the territory of settled, peaceful, unfortified farmers.
The physical evidence Gimbutas found of this collision is incredibly stark. It is a night and day transition in the archaeological record.
Let's look at the burial rites, for example.
In Old Europe, you had megalithic clan burials.
These were large stone chambers where extended families or entire clans were buried together communally over generations.
It perfectly reflects a collective egalitarian social structure where the group supersedes the individual.
Suddenly, right around the time Gimbutas dates these invasions, that practice stops dead.
It is replaced by the kurgan, the individual male burial mound or barrow.
Instead of a community resting together in the earth, you have a single dominant male buried under a massive artificial hill of dirt.
He is often buried with his weapons, and sometimes with a sacrificed wagon or sacrificed horses.
It is the ultimate architectural statement of individualism, hierarchy, and dominance.
Then look at the pottery.
The Cucutina Tripilia culture of Old Europe produced pottery that was highly advanced, colorful, and intricately painted with those beautiful spirals and feminine symbols we discussed.
Suddenly, that art style is wiped off the map.
It is replaced by what archaeologists call corded ware pottery.
It is utilitarian, simple, gray, and decorated merely by pressing twisted cords into the wet clay.
The vibrant color, the complex art, the cyclical symbolism, it all just vanishes.
And what replaces the Venus figurines is the most prominent cultural artifact.
The most prominent symbol found in these kurgan graves is the stone battle axe.
And it isn't just a functional axe, it is specifically carved to look like a horse's head.
The weapon itself becomes the sacred object.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, as Gimbutas passionately did, this isn't just a change in fashion or a shift in pottery styles.
This is the violent structural replacement of an entire worldview.
An egalitarian, agricultural, matrifocal worldview was systematically crushed and replaced by a hierarchical, individualistic, and heavily patriarchal worldview.
Now, Gimbutas and later researchers dug even deeper into the social structure of these invaders to understand why they were so aggressive.
They discovered evidence of a system driven by primogeniture.
Primogeniture is the inheritance rule, where only the eldest son inherits the family's wealth, land, and herds. Right.
Exactly.
So think about the mechanics of that. What happens to the second, third, and fourth sons?
They have no land, they have no herds, they have no wealth to attract a wife.
They have absolutely nothing to their name. If they want to survive and reproduce, they have to go out and take it from someone else.
The sources describe the formation of war bands comprised of these young, unmarried, landless males.
Usually ranging in age from 12 to 19.
They formed hyper-violent initiation cults. Historical linguistics refers to them as the Corios, or sometimes the Black Youth.
And they heavily identified with wolves and dogs.
They essentially operated as packs of predators, severing ties with their home tribes and sent out to conquer new territory.
To accumulate wealth and take whatever they needed, including women.
Right, because they were expanding into territories where they had no social ties. These bands of young men practiced exogamy.
Meaning marrying outside their tribe.
Often violently. They abducted women from the local Neolithic farming communities.
It is a brutally efficient mechanism for territorial expansion.
It really is.
Okay, I need to push back again here.
All right, what are you thinking?
When Gimbutas first presented this overarching theory that peaceful, artistic earth worshippers destroyed by the violent, patriarchal, horse-riding wolf bands from the steppes.
Yeah.
I completely understand why the establishment rejected it.
You do.
Yeah. It sounds entirely too narrative. It sounds too cinematic, like a Hollywood script written to perfectly encapsulate modern anxieties about patriarchy and war.
That is precisely how it was received.
Ah.
It deeply offended the sensibilities of the processual archaeological establishment.
The leading figures of the time, like Lord Colin Renfrew, who was an absolute titan of British archaeology, utterly rejected it.
Right, because their prevailing theory, the processual theory, was that cultures don't change through sudden, dramatic, violent invasions.
Their model favored osmosis.
They believed cultural change is slow, peaceful, and based on economic trade.
The establishment idea was that the peaceful farmers simply saw the cool new metal axes and the domesticated horses the steppe people had and thought, wow, that's a great technology, let's adopt that.
They believed the farmers slowly assimilated the steppe technology, and the culture naturally shifted over centuries.
They accused Gimbutas of letting her imagination run wild.
And because her theory emerged and gained traction, just as the second wave feminist movement was peaking,
A movement that enthusiastically embraced the idea of a lost, peaceful, matriarchal golden age.
her academic critics weaponized that association. They accused her of writing feminist fan fiction rather than hard science.
They claimed she was projecting a modern political utopian fantasy onto the dirt.
Her reputation in her later years suffered immensely. She was essentially marginalized in her own field.
But let's apply some common sense to the reality of human history, especially in the context of ecological pressure.
Think about the massive, chaotic ripple effects of climate change.
A drop in temperature thousands of miles away dries up a patch of grass.
A massive herd has to move to survive.
A tribe of desperate, heavily armed pastoralists has to follow that herd. And suddenly they collide with an unfortified society, and the entire trajectory of human civilization is violently altered.
How often do ecological pressures force sudden, dramatic, and violently rapid shifts in history?
It happens all the time. The idea of slow, peaceful osmosis in the face of starvation is incredibly naive.
Gimbutas understood that harsh reality. She saw the sudden, violent rupture in the archaeological record, the burned villages, the sudden shift in burial practices.
But for decades, her Kurgan theory was treated as a fringe idea, a cautionary tale taught to young archaeology students about what happens when you let mythology cloud your empirical science.
And honestly, that is exactly where the story would have ended.
She would have gone down in history as a brilliant, eccentric, but ultimately discredited scholar.
Until the 21st century arrived.
We are going to transition now from the dusty, bitter academic squabbles of the 1970s and 80s into the sterile, high-tech genetic laboratories of the 2010s.
This is the massive turning point. Between 2015 and 2017, a series of absolute bombshell scientific papers were published.
And crucially, these studies weren't based on interpreting the subjective squiggles on pottery shards, and they weren't based on analyzing obscure folklore.
No, they were based on the undeniable mathematical hard code of ancient DNA.
Teams led by brilliant geneticists like Esko Willerslev in Denmark, Christensen in Sweden, and the renowned David Reich lab at Harvard started doing something previously thought impossible.
They started extracting readable DNA from Bronze Age skeletons across Europe.
Let's briefly discuss the mechanics of how they did this, because it's miraculous. DNA degrades over time, especially in the damp soils of Europe, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
But scientists discovered that a specific, incredibly dense bone in the skull, located just behind the ear called the petrous bone, acts like a biological vault.
A biological vault.
Yeah, it preserves ancient DNA far longer and far better than any other part of the skeleton.
By drilling into these 5,000-year-old petrous bones, they could sequence the entire genome of the people living during this transition period.
And what the Reich lab and others found completely blew the lid off the academic establishment.
The DNA evidence showed that the transition from the Neolithic period to the Bronze Age in Europe was absolutely not a slow, peaceful assimilation of ideas through trade.
It was a massive, sudden, and overwhelming genetic replacement.
It was an invasion.
A total demographic overwrite. The genetic footprint of the Yamnaya, the Kurgan people, from the steppes that Gimbutas had pointed to decades earlier, suddenly appears in the European genetic record around 3000 BC.
And it sweeps across the continent with terrifying speed.
In some areas, like temperate Britain, there was a staggering 90% replacement of the local gene pool within just a few hundred years.
90%. The original Neolithic DNA practically vanishes, replaced by Yamnaya DNA.
The DNA proved Gimbutas' exact narrative. But the deeper the scientists looked into the data, the darker the reality of this so-called assimilation became.
The geneticists and archaeologists started combining DNA data with a new technique called strontium isotope analysis to look at specific burial sites.
We really need to explain how strontium works, because it's the smoking gun here.
Okay, let's break this down step by step for the listener. How does a rock in the ground tell us who murdered someone 5,000 years ago?
It works like a geographical barcode. Strontium is a naturally occurring element found in rocks and soil.
Okay.
As bedrock weathers and breaks down, the strontium gets into the soil and the local groundwater.
Right, and then plants grow in that soil and absorb the strontium.
When a child eats those plants or drinks the water or eats animals that grazed on those plants, that specific localized isotopic signature of strontium gets locked into their dental enamel.
Because your adult teeth form when you are a child.
Exactly. And unlike your bones, which constantly regenerate and replace their cells throughout your life, dental enamel does not regenerate.
Once it forms in childhood, it is locked.
It acts as a permanent, microscopic time capsule of exactly where that person lived when they were roughly 7 years old.
That is incredible. So they applied this strontium analysis to the early single grave burrows in Jutland, in modern-day Denmark, dating right to the start of this invasion period. What did they find?
They found that the skeletons in these early Kurgan-style graves were 90% male.
90%.
Which perfectly, chillingly matches Gimbutas' theory of the Koryos, the young, landless, male warbands.
It wasn't entire families migrating slowly. It was heavily armed bands of young men arriving first.
But the most horrifying confirmation came from a specific archaeological site in Germany called Ulo.
They excavated mass graves there containing what appeared to be family units, fathers, mothers, and children who had all been violently massacred.
Some had stone axes embedded in their skulls. Others had flint arrows in their spines.
When they ran the DNA and the strontium isotope analysis on these massacred families, they found something that makes your blood run cold.
The men and the children were local to the area. Their genetic and isotopic signatures showed they were descendants of the Yamnaya invaders who had settled there.
But the women, the adult mothers buried in these graves.
The strontium isotopes showed that the women were not local.
Wow.
They had grown up 50 to 60 kilometers away from the settlement.
Furthermore, their childhood diet was completely different from the men's, right?
The isotopes show that these women had been raised on the vegetable-based, agricultural diet characteristic of the Neolithic old European cultures, not the meat-heavy diet of the Yamnaya.
They were abducted.
Yes.
The genetic and isotopic proof mapped perfectly, flawlessly onto Gimbutas' archaeomythology. Violent male warbands swept in, wiped out or marginalized the local men, and took the local farming women as wives.
And if you need one more layer of proof, this genetic and archaeological synthesis was further cemented by a completely different discipline: historical linguistics.
A researcher named Gus Krunen looked at the foundational roots of the Proto-Germanic language, the language that developed out of this cultural collision in Northern Europe.
Remember, the Yamnaya invaders were pastoral herders. They spoke an early branch of the Indo-European language family.
But because they lived on the steppe and only herded animals, their vocabulary didn't have words for farming.
They didn't have words for specific grains or agricultural tools.
Krunen proved that a significant portion of the farming vocabulary in Proto-Germanic words for peas, turnips, and specific agricultural techniques do not have Indo-European roots.
They were adopted whole cloth from a non-Indo-European pre-existing language.
Where did they get those words? From the abducted Neolithic women?
The women who were violently taken into these patriarchal steppe tribes retained their localized knowledge of agriculture.
They passed their farming vocabulary down to their mixed heritage children.
The trauma of that invasion, the literal voices of those abducted women, is permanently baked into the linguistic roots of the words we use today.
It is incredibly rare in the history of science for an entire field to have to eat crow so publicly and so comprehensively.
You had a watertight case, the combination of ancient DNA proving massive demographic replacement, strontium isotopes tracking childhood diet and forced mobility, and historical linguistics proving cultural amalgamation all converged.
Every single hard science discipline validated what Marija Gimbutas, with her deeply mocked interdisciplinary archaeomythology, had predicted decades before the technology even existed to prove it.
So what does this all mean?
How does the rigid academic establishment react when the theory they called a feminist fairy tale turns out to be cold, hard, DNA-backed fact?
In November 2017, Lord Colin Renfrew, The grand old man of British archaeology, the champion of the processional movement, and historically one of Gimbutas' most vocal and fierce critics.
Stood up at the Oriental Institute in Chicago to deliver a memorial lecture.
And he did something you almost never ever see in academia.
He publicly, unequivocally apologized.
He admitted to the scientific community that he was entirely wrong.
He presented the new DNA evidence to the audience and stated plainly that Gimbutas' Kurgan hypothesis was magnificently vindicated.
He went so far as to call Marija Gimbutas the triumphant precursor of much current work.
It was a total vindication. She saw the truth because she refused to restrict her vision to just one academic lens.
While her critics were only looking at the chemical composition of the dirt and the volume of the pots, she was reading the mythology alongside the dirt.
She understood that human history is written in both bone and belief.
It is such a powerful lesson for you, for all of us, in the immense value of interdisciplinary thinking.
When your gut and the diverse data you've synthesized from multiple different angles tells you a clear story, but the rigid establishment tells you you're crazy, how do you hold your ground?
Gimbutas held her ground, enduring decades of mockery, until the Earth finally gave up its microscopic secrets to prove her right.
It forces us to entirely reconsider the value of the stories we tell. Folklore and mythology aren't just quaint stories we tell children at bedtime. They are the fossilized remains of actual human experience.
They are data.
Which brings us to the end of this incredible journey.
We have tracked the arc from the rich, symbolic, cyclical, peaceful world of old Europe and its life-giving goddess.
We have watched that stable world violently shattered by the patriarchal, horse-riding Kurgan invasions, driven by the desperate pressures of a changing climate.
And we have witnessed the ultimate scientific redemption of Marija Gimbutas, the woman who saw it all, vindicated by the undeniable truth of modern genetics.
This raises an important question, one that resonates far beyond the Neolithic period.
Gimbutas succeeded where everyone else failed, because she dared to treat myth as a legitimate form of historical evidence.
And I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to chew on as you go about your day.
If ancient DNA could reach back 5,000 years and prove that the heavily dismissed mythological theories of Marija Gimbutas were actually a hard, violent, historical reality.
What other ancient myths or legends are we currently laughing off as mere fairy tales? What other impossible ancient stories are just sitting there in the dirt waiting for the next monumental leap in scientific technology to prove them absolutely true?
It makes you look at every ancient text and every piece of folklore a little bit differently, doesn't it?
It really does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope you'll be back for our next exploration.
Remember that behaviorism analogy we discussed at the beginning, the idea that you can only measure what you can physically see.
Gimbutas proved that sometimes to really see the broken bones of history, you have to be willing to read the stories they left behind.